Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamara Ecker, Managing Director for British American Business here in New York, and it is such a pleasure to welcome all of you to our International Women's Day program. The universal theme for International Women's Day 2021 is Choose to Challenge. And thanks to both EAB's own network and our partner networks, we have had hundreds of executives who have chosen to challenge with us today. There is indeed power in numbers. I'm always proud of the work we do at British American Business, advocating for important business issues that affect businesses operating both in the US and the UK, perhaps none of which are more important than today's topic, which calls out gender bias and inequality. In fact, British American Business has a dedicated program series called The Stir, which addresses diversity, equity, and inclusion themes. Of course, we could not do any of that alone, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our members who continuously support these important conversations, and in particular, our Stir sponsors, who are ACCA, Broadridge Financial Solutions, EY, Marsh, Vodafone, and Tata Consultancy Services. I would also like to thank the UK's Department for International Trade, a partner for today, as well as all of our incredible speakers and facilitators who we will introduce shortly. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank and introduce the fearless women from within BAB's network who willingly shared their personal stories in an effort to help shine a light on the inequalities that exist and the strength it takes to power through. So thank you to Vanessa Hall with Broadridge, June Sugiyama with Vodafone, Alicia R. Steinman with EY, Elise O. Schroeder with Willis Towers Watson, Christina Christoforou, a member of ACCA, Swathi Bonthala with TCS, and Teresa Harvin with Broadridge. If you missed their stories on our social media, the team has put up a link in the chat for you to view. So we are about ready to kick off, but first a few house rules, please. In terms of timing, we will open the program with a 25-minute fireside chat, followed by a 40-minute moderated panel discussion. After the panel, we will send everyone into breakout rooms where you will have an additional 20 minutes or so to debrief and chat. We kindly ask everyone to please keep your microphones on mute, and please use the chat feature to submit any questions, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many questions as possible. Now it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce the moderator for today's fireside chat, Anna Mars, President of Global Commercial Services at American Express. In her current role, Anna serves as a member of American Express's Executive Committee and is responsible for the company's businesses devoted to serving small, mid-sized, large, and global companies. Immediately prior to joining American Express in 2018, Anna was the head of Standard Chartered's commercial and private banking divisions globally. Anna has spent time living in both London and New York with her husband and 2 children, and serves as the co-chair of British American Business's International Advisory Board. Anna, such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Tamara.
Welcome.
And happy little Zoom lag there, but happy International Women's Day to everyone. It's a fantastic day to celebrate, to recognize progress, and to forge new paths. So I'm really delighted to be here today with all of you. And delighted to be joined by Eileen Burbridge. For those of you who don't know or didn't Google in advance, Eileen is a partner at Passion Capital. Passion Capital is a preeminent early stage technology venture fund based in London. Eileen brings extensive experience to her role at Passion, gleaned from previous experience at some companies you may have heard of, including Yahoo, Skype, and Apple. And in addition to Passion Capital, Eileen also serves as Her Majesty's Treasury's Special Envoy for FinTech. She was appointed to that role by the Chancellor in the UK. She's also a non-executive director on a series of very interesting early stage companies, ranging from Monzo Bank to Digital Shadows to Marshmallow to Butternut Box. And if you have a dog and you haven't checked out Butternut Box, I'm putting a plug in there. So Eileen, it's great to see you today on this important International Women's Day. It's also, I think, a big day there in the UK because some of the kids have gone back to school. So congratulations on both fronts. But let's start just with more of your story. I'm American, but lived in the UK for 20 years and then just moved back to New York over the summer. You're also American, I understand, originally, but are now over in London, really spearheading the development of the fintech sector over there. So tell us a little bit about your transatlantic journey to get us started.
Thank you so much, Anna. I mean, it's, as you said, happy International Women's Day to you and everybody else as well. It's a privilege to be part of this program on International Women's Day. So thank you so much for having me. And, Anna, I actually wish the tables were turned because I would love to hear more of your story and your journey as well. But I think we're going to have to ask the BAB to organize that for a future date so that I can sort of maybe ask you a few questions. But in the meantime, yeah, so in terms of my journey, I was born and raised in the States. I have a computer science degree from the University of Illinois, which happens to be doing pretty well in the NCAA, or it's going to be seeded pretty well, I think, in the NCAA tournament for the first time in almost since I left the country. I then worked in Silicon Valley for a decade before I moved to London in early 2004. And the thinking was that I thought I had found my sort of center. I really fell in love with the Bay Area. I felt at home in Silicon Valley. I couldn't understand why anyone would want to live anywhere else other than the Bay Area, having grown up in the Chicago area. But I thought, therefore, it might be worth getting a year or two, international experience abroad and in an English language market, maybe handy, so I could be lazy at the same time. And then here I am 17 years later, thinking that was just going to be a short stint. And I have now given birth to 4 additional dual national people or citizens. So my kids are American citizens, of course, born here in Britain. I have dual citizenship now as well. And so I'm heavily invested in, and I guess as sort of a flag flyer by birth and by where I've lived for the last 17 years for the connection between the UK and the States, and always a big believer in collaboration between the two markets and the sectors. And so, for example, like you say, very kindly with fintech, it's a natural bridge, between what we do here in London as investors or as operators and people setting up those companies as to what, is happening in New York or in Silicon Valley.
Well, I'm sure it means a lot to the UK, you voting with your feet and championing fintech there. I think we often, or in the UK, there's often the thought of who the competitors are, whether it's Silicon Valley or other corners of the world. So it's fantastic. Now, when I spoke to you last week, Eileen, to get ready for this discussion, you were multitasking. And I'd love you to tell the group here a bit about what you were doing and multitasking. And I come on to that, asking you to do that because we all know the last year, the pandemic has affected our companies, have affected us professionally, have impacted the world, many, many ways geopolitically and beyond, but it's also impacted women at work personally. So tell us a bit about what the last year has been like for you personally. And I'd love the group to hear about what you were doing when we spoke last Thursday.
Sure. I should have taken a picture, could have shared a
So
selfie or something.
I should have.
No, it was a little embarrassing, I have to be honest. But, obviously I was really looking forward to this program. And as you say, we had a quick briefing call, but it was a tough week because we were getting ready for the kids to go back to school today in the UK. And so there was just all this sort of last minute prep with respect to, the shoes don't fit, the uniforms don't fit. They needed haircuts, at least my children anyway. I wasn't doing it regularly where they were off of school or doing home learning. And so, yeah, unfortunately, during our prep call, I was only doing Zoom with audio only, camera off, because I was cutting my 12-year-old's hair at the same time, trying not to nick him with the scissors. But that probably is a good example of, or a characterization of how COVID-19 and the pandemic has affected me personally. I think that, like everybody else, I'm sure who's in this, conversation today and going to be participating in the breakouts in the panel, there isn't a facet of my life that hasn't been affected by the pandemic. And I count myself incredibly lucky to have had the resources, the space and the time to cope with all the things I needed to cope with. But it's been, it's a full 360. So work-wise, as soon as it sort of took hold in, the end of Q1 last year, we went into serious sort of crisis mode with respect to our portfolio companies and just helping them to equip themselves. We invest in early stage companies. Monzo Bank's probably the most mature. It's got about 1,400 employees, 5 million customers, and a regulated bank. But, nobody's ever been through a pandemic, least of all these sort of younger management teams and executive teams. and we went through everything from cost cutting, redundancies, furloughs, how to look after staff, how to offer well-being packages, how to adjust to remote working. And so I spent a good 3 to 6 months really heads down with all of our portfolio companies. And thankfully, my partner was able to really focus on the kids during the first lockdown. So he was the one cooking literally 3 meals a day. And I was on back-to-back Zoom calls all day. And then, of course, we had home learning. And so with the children at home, I actually count myself really lucky. And I guess I'm a bit of a nerd because I knew at the time, maybe because I have so many. So I now have 5 children because I've got a stepdaughter as well. But with that range, my oldest is 14 and the youngest is 5. You always look at the 14-year-old and you think, I remember when you were 5 and how quickly it's gone. And so I kind of knew, even though I didn't know how long lockdown was going to last or how long home learning was going to last, it was such a unique time to have them learning or, being on sort of Zoom lessons from home and me being able to witness, how much they raise their hand or don't. I was a total geek and I made them all sit at the same table to do it so that, they weren't on their phones or they weren't just slacking off. But I absolutely loved it. I must have taken pictures, every other day of them around the table. I posted a bit on social media. And with the 5-year-old, I had to sit next to her in her Zoom lessons because it's not as if I could say, okay, listen to your circle time and then tell me what they told you about counting in 10 so we can do your worksheets. I mean, I listened with an earphone so that she was listening and then I knew how to reiterate what her teachers wanted us to work on with worksheets. And so it was fully sort of all encompassing, all engrossing. And, I think, like I said, I treasured it and I felt we were extremely fortunate to have multiple devices, for the kids to share. I wasn't even switched on initially, didn't get until maybe the 2nd or 3rd week headphones for everybody, hadn't really processed what this was going to mean. Got a new printer, but I'm really lucky to be able to do this, but we sort of went all in. It was pretty intensive in terms of the family, but just thinking about and trying to anticipate what the kids might be thinking, what they might need, what are they missing if they're not seeing their friends, what if they're not playing soccer after school, what if they're not going to the weekend, practices and things like that. And then I think, the third aspect, which I can't sort of ignore at all, is not forgetting about myself in terms of, having gone through pregnancy 4 times or raising the children. You kind of know that you can only be a good parent if you're in a good place yourself. Obviously, the more stressed I am, the less patient I am as a parent and the less understanding and I'm just too short and I'm just grumpy and I'll just probably tell them to go, do something else. And so I think for the first time, even after being pregnant all those times, I really sort of thought I need to make sure that I need to go to bed earlier than maybe I would have planned, or I need to stop working at a certain hour because I really needed to conserve energy for the next day. And so I think this kind of self-care, and it takes all sorts of different forms, though, it was the first time that I let myself do that. And I did it in different ways for all the different lockdowns. I'm proud to say I exercised a lot more during first lockdown, but I obviously peaked too early because then I completely gained a whole bunch of weight during the 2nd and 3rd lockdowns. But like I said, I think each time it was a different kind of self-care, but a real recognition that I had to make sure that I was in a good place. Otherwise, I wasn't going to be able to do right by, the family and the kids, or what I needed to do at work when I was able to sort of check in to do that. So
Well,
I think, all of that is to say, it really helped to sharpen priorities. And sorry to ramble
hearing
so
that
much.
description, though, I think what everyone, parents or any caregiver, man or woman alike, struggled with through this last year was that balance between an incredibly, insanely intense work environment, children who are suddenly around, and trying to find time for yourself. And it's impressive that you seem like you've achieved sort of more than I have in my last year. It's really, we'll talk offline about some tips. It's also interesting that you were with your kids at school every day, and you were also bringing your kids to work every day. It's like bring your daughter to work day every day for about a year. Now, everybody on this, you can ask questions to Eileen. You can just type them in the message feed. We'll pick them up for the last couple of minutes, try to get a couple of group questions to Eileen. But when you think about, so we're going to hopefully come out of this, something will return, whether it's the old normal, the new normal, or whatever's ahead. What's your view on the long-term impact of all of this on women's ambition, or women in the workplace? Like, what do you think is going to stick, either the good or the challenges?
So I think that there's a couple of good things that'll stick, or I'm hopeful that they'll stick. And then I think there are some things that'll probably set us back just a little bit, but I'm hoping that's temporary. I mean, I think starting with the second bit first and maybe sort of going negative, but ending on a positive note, I think that it's really, I've read the research, I'm sure many have seen the same, but even anecdotally, I doubt any of us needed numbers to know or to sense that women were probably shouldering much more of the burden than men during the pandemic. I mean, I can't see how there's any doubt about that. Even if, if it's not about children, it's about loved ones, it's about extended family members, it's about parents, it's about neighbors. And I think that, women just sort of reverted to being nurturing far quicker and sort of recognized how impactful everything was going to be well before I would have thought the general population, and certainly sort of men. And it's probably because men have benefited from being able to sort of assume other people were going to take care of whatever pastoral or, pastoral care in general. So I think that we've really felt the burden much more. I think that it's really clear that more women had to drop out of, professional work situations than men did, disproportionately so. And so I do think we're going to have a bit of a setback in terms of, women and their positions or relative positions in executive roles and ranks, managerial ranks, or just in the workplace full stop. So unfortunately, I think that's going to be a near-term setback, but I'm hoping that we will overcome that, or we'll be able to sort of, correct that when we come out of it. I think over time, some of the things that will benefit women are that there's clearly now a normalization to remote working, which will benefit, I think, women more so than, men or just the general population. I mean, I think, for my whole career, even though I've been really lucky and I've been able to prioritize the times I want to go pick up my kids from school, or I want to go make some kind of after school appointment and leave the office, I still always felt guilty, or I felt certainly really conspicuous. And I think I was doing it far less than men. I think now it's normalized that we don't have to, obviously, all be in person to keep being productive and to do work. And I think that now, maybe it wasn't the case, I think, in the first few weeks. I think it took a couple of months, but it's clear now in the UK after the third lockdown, nobody could ever sort of, call anybody out for being less dedicated or less productive if they're not in the office. And I think this is going to afford a lot more flexibility for women, which will make a huge, huge difference. And I think we'll make it easier, not easy, but easier than it's been historically for women to balance all the different things that they've had to balance, all along.
So working from home, or more working from home, and an acceptance that it's not like working from home, which I think it might have been some more, another generation of executives, but truly you can be productive at home. I totally agree, as a here to stay thing post COVID. You also talked about the women tended to take on more of the burden, if I can call it that, or the caregiving through the crisis. There's a question that's come in on the chat about that, about the role of caretaker. I mean, you grew up in technology. I grew up in financial services. Neither of those industries have a big overlapping Venn diagram when it comes to empathetic leadership. That's not something that either industry has historically been known for. Do you think we'll take forward more of an appreciation about the role of caregiving or empathy in leadership, once this is all behind us?
Yeah, 100%. I do think so. And I think that's true in business. And we've seen great examples for political leadership as well. I think it's been really clear that when there's a global health pandemic, we can't just expect that even between 9 to 5 or certain working hours or whatever, that people are still going to be productive, regardless of the context that they're dealing with outside of that work environment, no matter where they are physically. And so that by definition requires empathy and understanding what people are having to deal with or cope with in order for them to do their work. And so I do think for people, whether they're men or women, but probably, making a sweeping generalization, more women historically than men have had that empathy or that ability to project or to anticipate and see that for others. They're going to be stronger leaders because they'll recognize where the limits are, where the challenges are, and how to mitigate, drop off of performance, of productivity, of engagement, and fulfillment that people will be getting from their workplaces. So I do think that we have seen in this last year that a certain type of leader was much more effective. And I think it took time. I think had the lockdowns only lasted a couple of weeks and we went back to normal quickly, I don't think we would have seen this, because I think, and I remember a year ago, everyone was talking about leaders going into wartime CEO mode, right? That was the kind of metaphor that people were using, or crisis management. And I dare say that when people use those kinds of words or those kinds of descriptors, the thought is probably still really type A, aggressive, brutally focused on the bottom line, typically sort of male characteristics. Not saying that women can't do that, and I'm here to say that women have all those abilities as well, but I think that people would have been biased towards thinking a sort of typically male-dominated leadership style would have been most effective. As the pandemic wore on, and as we carried on during lockdown, it's really clear that you couldn't ignore what was happening. Initially it was, oh yeah, if you want to work from home, if that makes you comfortable. And I think anyone could go through those motions. Over time, people had to start recognizing that family members, relatives were getting sick. They were in the hospital. People couldn't visit them. People were pregnant, giving birth, trying to get married, mourning loved ones. And you just couldn't ignore it anymore. You had to have a leader who understood the context, because they couldn't afford not to. And I do think that was unnatural for a lot of business leaders. And I think they were pushed and challenged by their boards, I think by other senior leaders, and by example, by seeing other people and how that responded. Otherwise, people just drop out. They just don't have time, to deal with leaders who aren't recognizing what people are going through.
That it's funny, you take me back to those early days of the crisis, where at the start it did have a wartime vibe. It was about getting laptops to people who didn't have them, and getting service centers working from home. And it was kind of a big deployment, like
Exactly.
an invasion. But then it lasted for a year, right? And so and it wasn't something militaristic, like take that hill, or something that's,
Yep.
that's
It was
known.
no longer just tactical.
Hierarchy.
It really required emotion and empathy after a while. It wasn't just a tactical, how to get from point A to point B.
Well, it still does. I have to say.
It's more than that. That's the thing. It's expanded. Yeah.
So you're a technologist, actual computer science degree, seriously a technical person, and you've grown up in the technology sector. When you look at the pipeline of women at all into the top of that funnel, and yet women into leadership roles, it's even narrower than the industries on average. Do you think there'll be changes in technology? Can we finally break through and see, more girls, women coding, right up into the management layer? Is that going to happen?
I hope so. And that's something, that I really try and influence, or try and actually call for, to the extent that I can help affect it. I certainly hope so. I think, as you say, it's not very well balanced today, but I'd like to think that because it's a relatively younger, sector, whether you want to count it as 20 years old, 25 years old, maybe 40 years old, going back to the beginning of semiconductors, it's relatively young, right? It's younger, certainly, than financial services. It's younger than the legal profession. It's younger than accountancy or professional services and management consultancy or investment banking. And so because it's a younger sector, I do think it is trying a bit harder to be a little bit more self-aware as a sector. I think, right or wrong, a lot of technology people like to think that they're incredibly self-aware and that they can improve themselves, whether it's, biohacking sleep rhythms or what they eat. And so they do apply that to, problems that they see within the sector, for instance, diversity or gender balance. And I think, there's a lot of work to be done. It doesn't happen overnight. I don't believe it happens in a generation even. But I'd like to think that we're progressing and at least holding ourselves to account to a degree that's probably been higher than other industries typically did. And that's because it's technology that's providing the tools for holding people to account, right? Social media, giving people a voice, giving a chance for people to call out accountability. That comes from the tech sector. And while it's obviously being used for all sorts of things, some of which we don't like to see, I think it is used to help measure and improve things like diversity measures.
I love that idea. First of all, technology has been a younger industry, so why can't it make progress faster? But then the technology of holding us to account, or that's goal setting, or how we're tracking progress on sort of hard or soft metrics. So we only have a few more minutes, and what I found interesting about the chat with everybody who's here on the Zoom is they love the talk about caregivers and the labor of caregivers. and they're asking questions about like, what now? How can we both take this understanding of the importance of context and understanding the value of empathetic leadership and caregivers forward? And as you look ahead, Eileen, what can we all do individually, or doorbell, love it, individually or collectively? It's good. You know what? It happens. Like, that's nothing. Like, no one's naked there. It's all good.
I'm just going to ignore
what can
it.
we do to make
I'm
the
going to
good
ignore
stuff
it.
permanent?
Yeah, I think, conversations like this are probably the first thing to do, and to make sure that we don't forget these difficult but important lessons. And I think that given that it was so universal, everybody went through the same set of experiences, we're not going to have a case where it was, oh, it was only in London that we saw this phenomenon happen, or it was only in New York, or it was only in, the middle part of America. I think we all universally saw this, no matter what part of the world we were in. And so I think we have to constantly remind our leaders, but also the next generation, about what we saw and what's important, therefore, to be mindful of. Caregivers need to be, acknowledged. There needs to be a way to recognize the contribution that caregivers make. There needs to be a way to balance caregiving across a family network, but also more broadly across society. I think another thing that's happening in the UK right now is, this conversation about NHS nurses and the pay rises that they will or won't get here in the UK. I mean, it's, political views aside, we need to be more serious and committed to people who provide care services, across society, but as also just individual in our own families. And so we need to hold the men to account for that as well. And I think I mentioned early on, for the first lockdown, it was my partner. He was cooking 3 meals a day when I was really swamped with work. We totally switched it around for the second and third lockdown, but he did his part, and we need to hold other people, other members of our society to account as well, in order to spread the sort of burden of care, as well as the privilege of care and the love that you get from that and the fulfillment across all sorts of different people, and recognize what a valuable contribution that is and how much more productive that makes us as a society.
It's the two things that I took away from that, just in my own organization, is acknowledging caregivers, our empathetic leaders who are there with their people and both help look after colleagues at work and into their families. But also, you should think about it. I don't know about in your MBA, but like, this was like not a thing. I feel like we got the opposite training when I worked on the trading floor, when I worked in consultancy. So how are we teaching people also about how to ask the right questions, to listen and understand that context? I don't think we've learned a lot over the last year, but something that hasn't featured as prominently throughout the rest of our professional lives.
I think it's because everyone's realizing it at the same time. I think we couldn't have expected it in curriculum, because let's be honest, 10, 20 years ago, you had mostly men writing the curriculum and teaching the courses, or deciding this is what leadership looks like, and this is how we're going to teach people to be strong leaders. So I think we're it's up to us and people that we know, or people that we can influence, to sort of write a new set of curriculum, or to update that curriculum, and also the teachings and just the learnings in terms of setting an example, being role models, making sure that when we're in meetings and someone says they've got to go, to recognize that as being a really positive thing, not to make them, make them feel guilty about it, to maybe be proactive about it and say, listen, if this meeting's going to run over, some people are going to have other commitments, you got to do what you've got to do, and just being really mindful of that. I think it's incredibly important. It probably starts from other tactics too, like conversations we've been having for years, but maybe the pandemic helps to really fine-tune it, about sharing parental leave and family leave. And I'm sorry, I know we're running out of time, mostly because I've rambled so much, but there's one more thing I wanted to say. We've been talking a lot about the influence of the pandemic. I should have said this in my opening remarks in terms of how it affected me personally. I really think, I'm not sort of overstating this or exaggerating at all. As much as the pandemic affected me, I really believe that in summer 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement and all the social justice movement actually affected me just as much. And I don't know if that's because, as an American that was sitting here in London, I felt more helpless, or that I was just witness to something that I couldn't really control, although I doubt I could have controlled that in the States as well. But that had a huge, huge impact on me personally, in terms of, thinking about, in the middle of a pandemic, while we are also escalating these other issues, which have just gone on for too long, what is important to us as people, what's important with what we spend our time doing, and how do we sort of, balance all of these things. It was just a lot to take on. And so I think the conversations about caregiving as well, that's actually completely related to everything else with respect to social justice and racial inequality as well. Hugely, that Venn diagram, like you've talked about before, there's a big overlap there.
It's back to the theme about the importance of understanding context, which was so traumatic on many fronts, but the topic of racial justice globally, particularly in the States last year, is something that all of us will take away from 2020. So guys, I'm going to close there. I have to say, it's a surprising conversation when you get together a computer scientist and a banker, and they have a conversation about the value of context, the labor of caregivers, the importance of care and empathy, and to quote Eileen, the importance of updating and rewriting the curriculum by which we teach everyone, whether you're homeschooling like a master like Eileen, or into our organizations, about the importance of those topics, not just through a pandemic, but in building a healthy and future-proof organization. So Eileen, it was super fun. Great to see you. Can't wait till next time. And Tamara, back to you.
Thank you, Anna.
Eileen, Anna, thank you so much. I wish we had more time, but really grateful for the time that we did have, squeezed in between haircuts and deliveries. So I hope it was something good.
Thank you.
So thank you again. And for everyone who is contributing in the chat, we're monitoring that. Please do keep that up. And again, we'll have time in the breakout sessions after our panel. And just to note, like I said, there is power in numbers. We have over 500 people who've joined us today. So delighted to have all of you. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our power panel, Jess Wang, partner with McKinsey & Company's Silicon Valley office. Jess leads the Women in the Workplace project at the firm and is co-author of the Women in the Workplace report, which will help frame this discussion. Jess is also a leader in the marketing and sales practice, where she leads McKinsey's loyalty work in North America. Jess is a frequent author on retail and digital marketing topics and often speaks on advancing women in business. Jess, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks so much. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm so grateful to be with all of you today and with a fantastic panel. I'd love to start off by inviting everyone on the panel to introduce themselves. Maybe we start off with Nadine.
Hi, thank you, Jess. I'm so happy to be here with you. My name is Nadine, and I am the Chief
I think we're having a little technical trouble hearing you. Maybe we can circle back and have someone else introduce themselves.
Maybe we move on to Helen and then Nadine. I don't know if there's some headphones or anything that you can do to help with the audio issues. Helen?
Hi, Jess. So thank you for the invitation to join this fantastic panel. I'm Helen Brand, Chief Executive of ACCA. For those who don't know us, we're the global body for professional accountants. We have over 770,000 members and students in 176 countries around the world, a network of 110 offices and centres that service those members and their businesses and our other stakeholders. I became Chief Executive of ACCA in 2008, and I'm based in London. If my accent hadn't given me away or I haven't relocated, that's where I am at the moment and at home. And the reason I'm wearing headphones is because my neighbours have chosen the global pandemic to remodel their entire house. So it's better you just hear me and not that.
Thanks, Helen. And we also have Kim with us.
Kim Waller. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Hi, Kim.
Awesome. All right. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Kim Waller. I'm with Willis Towers Watson. I lead our diversity solutions practice. I'm based out of Chicago, and I look forward to joining this conversation.
Thanks so much, Kim. Nadine, can we try again?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Great.
Okay, fantastic. Hello, everyone. So So Nadine Augusta, I am the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Cushman & Wakefield. It's 2.5 months in, approaching 3 months in this role. Prior to Cushman, I was at Goldman Sachs as the America's Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And
Great.
that's in New York.
Thanks so much. I am so excited to jump in and talk with all of you today. But before we do that, I thought I would just start with a brief overview of the Women in the Workplace research that Tamara mentioned. As you all may know, this is the 6th year we've done the research, and it is an opportunity to pull together what is now the largest data set that we have in corporate North America in terms of women's representation in the workplace, as well as their experiences that obviously drive the representation as a end output. And so this past year, we had over 300 companies in the study participate, representing over 12 million employees. And we looked at, employees' experiences, as well as how companies were adjusting and dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. And so I mentioned this was in our 6th year, and what has been interesting is year after year, we've been doing this research, and one of the first things we did was we busted this myth, which is an idea that the reason women were not at parity in representation with men was because they were all leaving the workforce to go take care of their families. And what we found early on in our research in the 1st or 2nd year was that that wasn't true. Attrition rates were actually very similar. Women were asking for promotions as much as men were. And they were telling us that they were not planning to leave the workforce. Well, this year, COVID-19 put us at a bit of a crossroads. We heard that 1 in 4 women were actually considering leaving the workforce or taking a step back in their career. And so the equivalent in corporate America would be, 2 million women, or an equivalent of an entire graduating class of undergraduate and graduate degrees of women, which for us was, a big flashing red warning sign that we were at a place where there's something that really needs to be done. There were 3 groups in particular that stood out as facing very acute challenges. The first group was mothers, which, we just heard quite a bit about in terms of juggling childcare and a bunch of extra household responsibility. And yeah, the COVID-19 crisis put a ton more on mothers' plates. And when we looked at parents in dual career couples, or heterosexual parents at least, we found that mothers were 1.5 times more likely than fathers to be spending 3+ additional hours per day on household responsibilities compared to before the crisis. So, if you think about that and add up even just the minimum of the 3+, right, that's, pretty much a part-time job that you're adding on top of your existing job and on top of all of the household and childcare responsibilities that you already had. And more, pressing was this idea that the mothers that we surveyed told us that there was an additional sort of mental burden of worry that their performance was going to be judged negatively because of the fact that they had all these additional household responsibilities. The second group of women that really stood out in our research were senior women leaders. And senior women leaders told us way more than their peers, senior men, as well as other women, that they were more likely to be constantly exhausted, felt like they always needed to be on, and felt really burnt out. And it was very concerning to hear that 1 in 4 senior women were considering leaving the workforce or downshifting their careers, because we also know from our research that companies can't afford to lose senior leader women. They're much more likely than senior men to champion diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, and they're much more likely to consistently take action accordingly, such as mentoring and sponsoring other women or women of color, or publicly acknowledging and giving credit to women of color for their ideas. So that, was another group that really stood out to us as a at-risk group due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the last one here was we really saw a terrible experience for Black women. And we knew that Black women were always having a harder time in the workforce, but given the disproportionate impact of the crisis on the Black community and the events of racial injustice, we heard from Black women that, they were 2.5 times more likely versus non-Black women to report the death of a loved one as a major challenge. And then 1.5 times more likely than non-Black women to feel uncomfortable sharing their experience of grief or loss on top of that. So, given all of this and the challenges that we saw with the women, a lot of our research shifted to what can companies do and what can we as colleagues to each other do. And I'd love to talk a little bit about that with the panel today. But overall, I think there's this feeling of it's truly a crossroads. On one hand, there's opportunity to take what we've learned and work from home and remote work to create a better workplace for everyone and retain and hire more diverse, employees. But on the other hand, if we don't address these challenges, it's, very, very difficult to be able to see how women can stay in the workforce and continue to progress and perform at their best. So with that, I'll shift over to talking to my panelists here. Maybe we kick off by sort of taking one of the points in our study as a jumping off point, which is this idea that over the last 5-10 years, there's been a lot of noise about the glass ceiling. But in our research, we found that it's not just the glass ceiling, there's also something we call the broken rung, which is the fact that from entry level to manager, there's a very, very big difference between men's promotion and women's promotion. In fact, for every 100 men that are promoted to manager, only 85 women are promoted, 58 Black women and 71 Latina. And so if you imagine so early on the pipeline, you have this big discrepancy, you have a really hard time being able to achieve parity later on. And then, given the pressure to downshift and the additional stressors, this could make a very, very difficult workplace moving forward. I'd love to hear from our panelists here, what broad ramifications for the leadership pipeline of the company do you see? And, what do you think business leaders and people who are making the decisions do to mitigate this shift? I'll start maybe with Nadine.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question and for the research. What we're seeing and what your research has really captured is really not new to us. If you think about the fact that we've been challenged with growing our representation of women for many years. And so from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, the agenda in our organizations has included women, hiring women, retaining women, developing and promoting women in the organization. And I think in this moment, it's really important for us to really reinforce our efforts and ensure that we don't sort of become complacent. I think it's really important that our managers in our organizations get to know and ensure that they know the women on their team. They know what might be happening, what their situations, individual situations might be, and that they're creative and flexible in how they provide support to the women in their organizations. I think that's something that just has to happen across the board. As well, I think more broadly, organizations need to take a step back and really review their wellness policies, review their, parental leave policies, elder care, childcare benefits, to ensure that they are, as strong as they could be and as they should be, and also to bring some creativity in what needs to happen now in this moment to ensure that the women in your organizations are supported. And so those are all things that we are doing at Cushman & Wakefield. I think every company can and should take those steps. It's so important, all the points that you made, that we, double down and ensure that we're supporting and retaining the women in our organization.
Yeah, no, I love that it's, it's not just one thing, right? It's a bunch of things that you do together that can help enable and support the women Kim, what about, what you all are doing and from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. So I want to, build on your question around promotion rates and how that has been opened up, and the spotlight that's been placed on that at the intersection of the impact of COVID and even the racial equity social justice movement, focusing specifically on women of color. And as your research laid out, I thank you so much for delineating the differences between women and women of color, and the promotion rates and where they are within an organization. And one of the things that we think about that is thinking about promotion rates and understanding networks are impacting promotion rates, right? That it's not just about meritocracy, it is about who you know. Some organizations, it's more structured, but many organizations, not that you've gotten into the organization, that you've been hired, but what does it take for you to get to that next level? And from entry level to mid-level to senior level, we all know the importance of social networks in helping to elevate you to that space. And what the pandemic has done with remote learning, if you didn't already have strong social networks, it then made it another hurdle for you to have to overcome to be able to build those relationships. And if you had them, you had to be creative about sustaining them. And there's all kinds of research, right, around if you look different than the person that is above you, just the additional work that women of color have to engage in order to build those bonds and those relationships that then are key to people being able to be promoted. So as we think about where do we go into a better than normal after the pandemic, the question is, how do we begin to create more visibility for women overall and women of color in ways that women of color, in many cases, while talented, have been invisible in many organizations. So things like moving beyond mentorship as a baseline, but sponsorship and being very intentional about it is some of the things that we see organizations that are being intentional about moving to the next better than normal are doing.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Helen, I'd love more of like an international perspective. I know you have a broad range of experiences globally. I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Sure. So some of the issues are very similar. In some ways, though, I think the USA is ahead. There's still a lot to do from what Nadine and Kimberly are saying, but ahead in terms of visibility of the issues and measurement and the kind of reports that you're putting out. Here specifically in the UK, there's been progress at the leadership level in sense of boards, and you may know about the campaign for representation of women on boards, and that hit 34.3% this January for the first time. So it hit that third. But still, executive leadership, which is deemed to be the members of the executive team or direct reports, it's still under 30%. And of the 350 FTSE top companies, the top companies in the UK, still only 17 female CEOs. It's just so there's a long way to go. Now, for ACCA globally, 59% of our 500,000 or so students are women, which is fantastic. 47% of the membership women, but still, that progress is something that still isn't happening. We're still not seeing the top roles being taken. So it's so multifaceted, isn't it, in terms of the action that can be taken. And actually, we're running a whole series of events and reports at the moment called Inclusion in Action for 3 months, just to try and drive this home, particularly in this period around the pandemic, that action does need to be taken. And I think you'd expect this from a professional accountancy organisation, but transparency and reporting have to be a really important starting point there. Collecting the data in a meaningful fashion, reporting on your future plans and whether you've achieved them. It amazes me how businesses can each year have a different set of data. There's no tracking, there's no sense of progress, there's no accountability. And I think we absolutely have to drive as business leaders that accountability, hold ourselves to account. It can be uncomfortable because the data can reveal things we don't like, but we have to get uncomfortable in order to make progress. I think that's incredibly important. And I think in the context of the pandemic, which we've been talking about today, fantastic insights from everybody. I think we shouldn't forget the role of public sector or government sector in all of this. And we've been doing a big piece of work around gender responsive budgeting and ensuring that the plans and the packages that are put together by governments in the face of the pandemic to support business actually tackle those gender issues and ensure that the right funding is going towards the rebuilding that's going to enable women to stay in the workforce and to progress in the workforce. I mean, 39% globally of the workforce, employed workforce, is female. 54% of the jobs that have been lost during the pandemic have been women. You know, so there's a real imbalance there, and then so the government action, the private sector action has to align to ensure we get that better environment that Kimberly was talking about.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, I'm interested too. I think, Kim, you had mentioned this idea of promotion rates and being thoughtful about what it takes for someone to get promoted. It also, I think, relates to this idea that, you know, what you set as performance targets and performance expectations really matters, right? And actually in this last year, despite the fact that we know that women have been facing extra pressures and extra challenges, we've seen that across the board, for the most part, there have been no shifts in performance targets. And so while the targets have stayed the same, the extra challenges and burdens that women have faced inside and outside the workplace have increased. And so this really ramps up the expectations for women, especially, to overperform. Do you think this effect is being recognized and acknowledged? And, you know, how do you think corporate leaders should be addressing this going forward?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a lag, right? I think, as Eileen had mentioned, in the beginning, I think leaders were like, business as usual, just plow forward, you know, suck it up, you know, make whatever arrangements you need to and get it done. But because the pandemic is gone a year plus, I think leaders are now catching up because the impact of having to balance family issues, whether it's your children or elders, whomever it may be, just having to balance life in many, if you're in the professional services space, particularly in a remote type of work environment, leaders are now readjusting to say, okay, what do we really need to do for the long haul? And I'm hearing leaders reinforce the importance of self-care and taking time off and unplugging, because they know in order to continue to have a stable workforce, they cannot, I mean, short term, yeah, you can plow through full steam ahead, but long term, you cannot keep people without having them unplug and leave the workforce and or move to another company. Candidly, there's still, in the pandemic, particularly in certain industries, there's movement across companies, because those companies that have gotten this right, that are creating ways to have a culture of well-being and balance, are going to be the companies that are going to attract top talent. Those companies that do old school, you know, I need to see you on screen, I'm counting your screen time as a measure of productivity versus outcomes, those companies over the long haul aren't going to be able to sustain maintaining top talent. And specifically for the purposes of today's discussion, women, they're just not going to be able to keep top women talent in their companies.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think there are themes from what we heard from Eileen as well, right? Being a more empathetic leader and addressing the core challenges. I'm curious, you know, to hear what our other panelists think here. Do you, like, which of the changes do you think are actually going to stick in terms of this flexible model and the focus of mental health? Helen, I don't know if you have a perspective on this.
Sure. Well, I think just going back to what Kimberly was just saying, I think there is much more of a focus now on that long-term value creation, and that's really been driven home by the pandemic. So what are you going to value as an organization, as a business? What is the output going to be? What's your contribution to society? You know, businesses they were starting to address that, but I think that integrated view of what it is that creates is really coming to the fore. And I see that, you know, I don't see that going away. It's both reputationally important, it's important for long-term finance. So I think that's incredibly important. The flexible, the empathetic leadership, I've been trying to do that for a long time myself, and I think it's incredibly important. I think, you know, we have to really challenge what is accepted as leadership, don't we? What is leadership? It can come in many forms. It can come in, but what at the end of the day, it's about what are you producing that's valuable. And are you and that whole human capital piece, along with the financial capital, natural capital, you know, we could talk about all the other challenges that are facing organizations, but and women at the heart of that have to be absolutely key. So I think empathy, along with flexibility and understanding what genuine contribution means, over and above presenteeism, whether it's present on a screen like this or present in an office if they open again in certain parts of the world. I think there is going to be that flexibility and understanding, and hopefully that will make it a much better environment for everyone, which is always the key, isn't it, at the end of this?
Yes, absolutely. I do, you know, I want to hear from Nadine, your perspective too. I also do want to remind the audience that after this moderated session of the panel, I'd love to incorporate your questions as well. So please feel free to send in your questions via chat. Nadine, what are your thoughts on what will stick, what will not, what has to stick?
I agree with everything that's been said. You know, what I would add is there's definitely, I think, been a recognition that we do have to provide more support to managers and to leaders so that they can better lead, so that they can really, you know, play their part in supporting the workforce and ensuring that our employees feel well supported and we're able to retain the talent that we want to retain. You know, the other thing that I would say is, you know, there's been a lot of talk around, you know, what's going to happen with the return to office. And we know that some companies, you know, especially in the tech space, have made bold choices not to come back to office. Commercial, you know, coming from a commercial real estate company, you know, of course, we you know, believe that there's definitely going to be a return to office for most companies, but what that looks like, you know, post-COVID is really going to be different. And you know, there are definitely some valuable you know, experiences that happen in person that we feel will continue to be best done in person. Negotiations, you know, delivering you know, sensitive feedback, building culture, relationships, all of that and more are things that, you know, are done in person. So you know, I do think that flexibility, of course, and you know, how we define flexibility, what that looks like, recognizing that it's not one size fits all, uber important in all of this, to ensure that our employees are supported in the way that they need to be supported to do their best work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've talked about a lot of topics today and a lot of things that companies can and should be doing, and many that, you know, your companies are already doing. I guess if we think about this, you know, negative impact of the pandemic on women, we talked about mothers, Black women, you know, senior leaders like yourselves. I'm curious, what if you had like one big call to action, right, to leaders now, and what you think is truly needed from them in terms of their governance and leadership to make sure that we don't backslide on all the progress we've made? What would that big call to action be? Kim, I'm curious to hear what your big call to action would be.
Yeah, my call to action, kind of going back to my original statement around being able to see the is I would say very tactically to take a look at your social networks, take a look at who you typically engage with and respond to, and broaden it. And that's going to help you as you think about the decisions that you're making that are impacting your organization. Your workforce, 9 times out of 10, is over the next years going to become more diverse. And your ability to be able to connect authentically with your workforce is going to partially be predicated on your understanding of who they are as individuals and the complexity of who they are as individuals. And the best way to be able to truly develop empathy is to develop a relationship, right? So expand your networks so that your connection to your people is authentic.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. What about, for all of us as women, we're all in this together. I know, much has been made about this idea that everyone should lean in together. Does that apply right now? Should it be something else, given we're in such an extraordinary time? How do you think about the way we should find the balance between leaning in and burning out? I sort of loved what we heard earlier from Eileen about this idea that, she really needed to double down on self-care at this time to make sure that she could show up for every other person in her life that really needed her. Helen, I'm curious to hear what you think about this.
Sure. Well, I think everyone needs to have opportunity and challenge to develop themselves and progress, but I think we also need to challenge the idea that women have to do more and be better in order to succeed, because that's not equity, that's not equality. If you're being constantly required to perform to a higher standard. I jokingly, and this is kind of paraphrasing for effect, but I jokingly say that we'll have achieved true equality when we accept our mediocrity in the same way that men do. Because what I mean that is, it's kind of, you quite often see people very confidently in roles without much behind them in terms of what it is that's got them there. We know that women don't put themselves in that place, but because we don't have that inherent confidence in mediocrity. So I do think we have to not beat ourselves up. That's what, don't beat yourself up. Strive, challenge, take opportunities, but we know there is that context, and we have to be the role models of embracing that as leaders and making it work in a healthy and productive fashion. And that is the role modeling that will bring everyone with us.
I love that. Nadine, what do you think?
I think about just my own experience over the course of the past year. I have to say double down on your own, wellness and mental health. I think it's just so important, and we know that women often neglect. We often neglect ourselves, and so double down there. I would also say ask for what you want, ask for what you need. Be transparent about what's happening with you, with your managers, with your leaders, and ask for what you need, what type of support you need, the flexibility that you need. If you don't ask for it, you will not get it. So I think that's a really, really important point.
Yeah, I saw we actually have an audience question coming in, and a lot of people are curious here. Given sort of generational differences in the workplace and a younger professional cohort that's coming in, what do you all think that companies need to do to think about how you change the environment so they're not just being recruited in the exact same environment of similar challenges, similar stereotypes, similar barriers? I think Kim mentioned in terms of networking, all of that. I don't know if any of you have a perspective. Kim, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, I think, again, one of the challenges and the gifts that the pandemic has provided to us is this really integration of our home life balance. At one point it was a nice to have, but now it really is an imperative. And the research that we've done, it says that younger generations expect that. They expect work-life balance. They expect a company that's truly living its values versus something that's on a postcard in the lunchroom. They expect an organization to be socially responsible, however that is defined. And there's not like buckets, right? I come from the generation where I learned to compartmentalize. I do this at work and I do this at home and I do this in my community, right? So nice, tiny little compartmentalized buckets. But to keep younger talent, you're going to have to be able to provide, an organization is going to have to provide cultures and opportunities that embrace all of it and in all of its fluidity in order to keep that talent. So I would say, listen and tap into what your younger talent is saying that they want and they need. Don't be prescriptive. I would not be so presumptive to even assume that I know all that they're looking for, but take the time to listen to what your talent is telling you that they need, and then think about how you can give it to them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And in some ways, you know, it's a bit of an experiment, right? You don't have the answer, and you have to have the right feedback loops. And Helen mentioned earlier, you have to collect the data so you can look, you know, year after year longitudinally, are we doing this in the right way? Are we actually making an impact? And so I think you both brought up great points there. We have another question here, and it has to do with this idea that we might take remote work and a flexible work schedule into the future as a new normal. And I think there's been some concern that, and I saw earlier in the chat, women might, you know, take advantage of that more than men because they have the increased needs, you know, outside of the workplace. Do we think it's important that all employees should be together in the office on the same days? And I think the root of that is this idea of, do we have any concerns that being a remote worker is actually going to impact your opportunity to be promoted as a woman?
Shall I come in? Yeah, I think we have to be really careful about this as we, you know, get through the pandemic and we have more options in front of us. Because I think the one of the positives of the current work environment has been the democracy of it. You know, far more people can participate. You're not limited by the size of a room or how far away somebody lives, if they're in a different country, a different city, whatever it might be. You know, participation has been easier, and it's been on a level playing field. You know, everybody's doing it in the same way. So I think keeping that democratic participation and sense that you can have a voice and belong and make a difference is going to be really critical. I think it's going to be different models for different types of business, different types of organization, even different teams within your organization. And when we've been looking at what we're calling the hybrid model for post-pandemic working, then it's really been around roles and teams and what are people going to need from each other? How are they going to, you know, what kind of interaction do they need? And very clearly, we can't leave people out. And so that visibility factor that we know has been so critical to achieving promotion in the past, we have to make it possible for everyone to be visible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for all of you and your fantastic perspectives. I know I learned a ton, and from all of the great chat next to my window here, I can see that this has been super thoughtful, thought-provoking for everyone. Unfortunately, at this time, we'll have to close the panel, but thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, and I'll hand it over to Meg McSherry to talk to us a little bit more before everyone heads into a breakout.
Thanks, Jess. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. First, I'd just like to say thank you to all the panelists that shared their stories, their insights, and their journeys today. Your authenticity, your vulnerability exemplifies the resilient leadership that we all need in our organizations and the reason that we're here today. As you've heard, the need for women in leadership and empathy in decision-making has never been more urgent. All women, particularly women of color, were adversely impacted during the last year. I think it's important to realize that COVID and the social issues of 2020 didn't create new inequalities, it just emphasized existing ones. A burnout and the increased mental load is real. And regardless of whether women are at the individual contributor level or at the leadership level, we all struggle with creating balance between disconnecting from work and moving to our second shift, whatever that might be. As Eileen illustrated, we become masters of multitasking. And as a mother of 3 young kids, I try to realize that I'm thankful for being home and being closer to what they're doing every day and more. And it makes my heart happy to see my daughter recognize the work that I do and want to work like mommy when she gets older. And at the same time, and I never thought I'd say this, I miss my commute. I definitely have pulled the crying baby into my lap on a Zoom call more often than I'd like to say. As Jess's study points out, 1/4 of women today are likely to scale back or to leave the workplace because of these challenges, and that leaves the broken rung even more damaged. We discussed whether leaning in is still relevant and has the meaning that it had a couple years ago, and I believe that we do have to lean in, but we have to lean into the opportunities in this environment to create balance, wellness, and mindfulness. It's that balance that will allow us to be better, motivated, and empathetic parents, caregivers, colleagues, and leaders, which, as Helen said, provides meaningful value and productivity that we can add to our organizations. And we've seen this both in political world as well as business environments. Diverse leadership isn't just the right thing to do. It builds a better business case. So thank you for sharing all your examples of the needed calls to action, building your network, and understanding who people are as individuals. There's a window of opportunity here for change, and the urgency should motivate all of us as women leaders to choose to challenge ourselves to create more space at the table for other women leaders. So today we invite you to talk about all of these topics in more smaller groups for the breakout sessions, and you'll be redirected to your breakout rooms momentarily. Again, thanks for joining us today and look forward to hearing more from you.
Well, welcome back. And we are now at the close of our program. A huge thank you to all of our speakers and facilitators and storytellers who helped in building today's event. And thank you all for choosing to challenge with us today. Again, if you'd like to learn more about our STIR program series, please do be in touch with one of the team. And until next time, it was good seeing everyone, and take care.